At the opposite end of the spectrum is the cognitive view of language. And I'm putting an asterisk here just to remind you that what I mean by this is the constitutive conception of language, whereby language is formative of human thought, and language is inextricably tied to human thought. Now, this view is typically associated with, among others, Ferdinand de Saussure, von Humboldt, and probably most famously with Sapir and Whorf. Now, the idea here is the exact opposite of the communicative view. So the idea here is that language is prior to the concepts inside our mind. In fact, language shapes the kind of thoughts that someone can have. For example, the idea that linguistic labels actually shape and organize how our thoughts work. To go back to the example of color, the idea here is that there exists a physical reality. Then because our language makes available to us certain labels to refer to physical reality, those are the concepts that we develop. So what we develop in our mind is different according to what labels, in this case, our language makes available to us. In the sense, we are forever prisoners of our own language. If your language only gave you 2 words for color, that's how you would conceptualize, under this view, color in sort of 2 groups, 2 categories. If instead your language gives you 1 million different labels for colors, that's how you would categorize in your mind, despite my exaggeration. That's how you would conceptualize color. But let me further explain by using the words of von Humboldt and Benjamin Lee Whorf to explain this position. So von Humboldt said, there resides in every language a characteristic worldview. As the individual sound stands between man and the object, so the entire language steps in between him and nature. In the sense, man lives primarily with objects, but he actually does so as language presents them to him. In other words, as I said earlier, you're forever locked in and prisoner. Everything, your whole reality is filtered through the labels of your language. You can only, your concepts, how you understand the world, is filtered through the language that you speak. Along very similar lines, Benjamin Lee Whorf famously said, the world is presented in a kaleidoscopic flux of impressions, which has to be organized somehow by our minds. And the means of organization of this kaleidoscopic flux is primarily provided by language. Again, as in the example I gave you earlier on color, the world is a continuous of impression. It's a continuum of impressions. And we somehow need to chop this continuum in discrete categories that we can use as concepts. And the idea, according to Benjamin Lee Whorf, is that we chop this continuum of impressions into the units according to whatever units our language gives us. As I said earlier, if your language gives you 2 colors, 2 labels for colors, well, that's how you're going to conceptualize colors. If you have 15, 20, 100, well, that's how you're going to conceptualize color. So in a sense, you can think of it again as the opposite of the communicative view. In the communicative view, the world exists out there, physical reality, and everything is filtered through the organs that you use for sensing and what is relevant to those organs. And that's where our categories presumably might come from. On the other hand, under the cognitive view, the world is physical reality is a continuum of impressions, and we chop those, we filter those impressions according to the means that our languages make available to us. And that's what Humboldt meant when he said, in every language, there's a characteristic worldview. We are biased to interpret the world using the labels, the language we have. Again, using the words of Benjamin Lee Whorf, under this view, you're just not free to describe nature in sort of some impartial and absolute and objective way. You're forever constrained to certain ways of interpreting nature. And what constrains you is the language that you have. So the cognitive view, particularly in Sapir and Whorf's approach, really is made of two central hypotheses. Now, the first, often referred to as linguistic relativism, is really about causality. And it's a hypothesis about what is the mechanism, how does language affect thought, through what mechanisms does language affect thought. And the idea here is that of language variability, the fact that different languages vary in the grammar they have and vary in the labels they have. And see, because languages vary in their labels and their grammar, this means that they organize perception of the world in a different way. Again, according to the number of words you might have to describe color, you might organize color in your mind in a different way. This means that according to which language we speak, we build in our mind different cognitive structures. And see, this is how language exerts its effect on human thought, by leading us to build different cognitive structures on the basis of which language we speak. And again, you can see this as playing out in at two different levels. Either a specific level, so the idea that the specific type or number of labels that a language may make available to you to describe something, well, that constrains the way in which you can think about it. And I'll give you the example shortly of the number of words for snow in Eskimo. At a more general level, you can think of it of the idea that there might be the general grammar makeup of a language might just make some concepts possible or impossible. And here I'll give you shortly the example of time in the Hopi language. But so again, the idea is that linguistic relativism is the mechanism by which language affects thought. And that mechanism is linguistic variability. Now, the twin hypothesis to linguistic relativism is linguistic determinism. And see, linguistic determinism is a hypothesis about what or to what extent does language affect thought. And typically, this hypothesis is seen in at least three different ways. The first is typically referred to as the strong form of linguistic determinism. And this really says language determines thought. And it's a sort of language has full power of determining what you can and what you can't think. As you will see, it is hard to defend this hypothesis. And so typically, linguistic determinism is presented in what is often referred to as the weak linguistic determinism. Sometimes, or rather a variant of it is known as cognitive linguistic determinism. But either way, the idea is that language influences your thought rather than determining it. And it does so by making certain ways of thinking, more habitual or just simpler, cognitively more efficient. And so just because your language provides certain concepts for you, it doesn't quite determine what you can think, but it just makes it so much easier to think about things this way and not that way. And so in this sense, the language you speak still has an important effect on the way in which you think. Finally, there's a third form of linguistic determinism, typically referred to as the weakest form of linguistic determinism, which really just says that language affects memory because the length and frequency of the name for something just makes it easier or less easy to remember it. And this is the spectrum of the degree to which language might affect human thought.